All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Christine Hansberger, and this is the Teaching Strategies for Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder training. And so we're going to be talking about evidence-based strategies and teaching strategies for students with ASD. So initially, let's talk about what are evidence-based strategies. There are a plethora of interventions that are available for students with ASD. Some that have evidence and some that don't, some that have been actually found to have caused harm. So we want to make sure that when we're selecting interventions for our students, that those interventions are the most likely to be successful. And so evidence-based practices are those practices that have been shown through scientific research to have the most efficacy. They have been shown and demonstrated again and again to yield positive results for students with ASD. These interventions are described as those that are evidence-based. They have been, we use evidence-based practices to maximize the likelihood that the interventions and strategies we are employing are likely to be successful. So in guiding our selection of evidence-based practices, there are two documents that are available to practitioners to aid in the selection of these interventions. These two reports, the National Professional Development Center's report and the National Autism Center's National Standards Project report, are two reports that have looked at hundreds of studies and evaluated those studies based on a number of criteria. And what these reports have found is that according to the National Professional Development Center, there are 27 evidence-based practices that they identified as having the most sound scientific backing. In addition to those 27, there are 14 evidence-based practices according to the National Autism Center's National Standards Project that have been found to be evidence-based. And they found that those studies, they classified them as effective interventions based on the studies that they reviewed. So this is a list of the 14 interventions that the National Autism Center National Standards Project found as evidence-based. This next slide are the 27 interventions identified by the National Professional Development Centers, the 27 practices that they found were evidence-based practices. And many of these interventions are encompassed within the 14 interventions. So this is a longer list of interventions, but many of these interventions fall under a broader category that was identified by the National Autism Center. So in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the following evidence-based strategies. We're going to be looking at discrete trial training, task analysis, antecedent-based interventions, video modeling, prompting, story-based interventions, and incidental and naturalistic interventions. So these interventions we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail as we go through this presentation. If you guys have questions as we're going along, please feel free to type them into the chat and I'll be able to respond to those as we go through the presentation. So under the broad category of behavioral interventions, we're going to talk about 5 main strategies. So of these 5 main strategies, we're going to talk about discrete trial training, task analysis, antecedent-based interventions, video modeling and prompting, So the first evidence-based strategy that we're going to discuss is discrete trial training. And this falls under the umbrella of behavioral interventions. It's based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. And what we do in discrete trial training is we take a skill and we break it down into its component parts. There are main components of discrete trial training. The first is the initial instruction, which we're only going to deliver one time. So the initial instruction is delivered by the teacher. This is also called the discriminative stimulus, or the SD. The next is a prompt if the child needs a prompt. So after we've given that initial instruction, if the student doesn't respond, we're going to go ahead and deliver a prompt, which we're going to talk about later on in the presentation. And the prompt is going to be present in order to help the student respond to that initial instruction. After we've given the SD and the prompt, if necessary, the student is going to respond. And after the student responds, we're going to deliver a consequence. And that consequence can either be positive in the form of a token. I love the way you did, I love the way that you touched red. Nice job, here's your token. It could also be corrective. So if the student made an error, we would go through a correction procedure. And then we'd also provide a short pause in between teaching trials. So for example, if we wanted to teach an academic skill, So I'm going to talk to you about the ways that discrete trial training has been delivered. Discrete trial training is effective to teach a number of skills, one being academic skills. So for example, if we wanted to teach a student the academic skill of identifying colors. So we could break this up and deliver it in a discrete trial training format. And so we'd identify the SD, which would be, say, touch red. And so we would give that SD to the student. We'd say, Johnny, touch red. So that would be the SD. The response to that would be that Johnny touches red, or that Johnny hasn't learned that skill yet, and we're going to go ahead and prompt him to touch red. And then following that response, we're going to provide a consequence. So this could be a positive consequence, like, I love the way you touched red, here's a token, or here's an edible. Or we can provide a correction if Johnny touched the wrong color. Discrete trial training has also been used to teach attending, imitation skills, and symbolic play. I've provided a link on the bottom of this slide so that if you're interested in learning more about discrete trial training, the National Professional Development Center, in addition to coming up with these evidence-based practices, they also created modules. So you can go to these modules and click on them, and it'll give you more information about the strategy that we're talking about, as well as some comprehensive lists of how to implement the strategies. The next evidence-based strategy we're going to talk about is task analysis. So in a task analysis, what task analysis is we're going to break down a skill into its component parts. And then we're going to teach each of those component parts separately. So as we're teaching the skill, we're going to teach one part of it. And then as the student masters that one part, we're going to teach the next part of the skill. And so eventually, the student will be able to complete the entire task independently. So here's an example of a task analysis for teaching a child how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Most of us have made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in our lives, and we know the steps that are involved in making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but it's really helpful, even though we know what steps are involved, when we're writing it out, it's really helpful to make sure that we actually do those things. You know, we go through the steps of the task analysis. And something that could be really helpful when you're developing a task analysis is having somebody else take your task analysis and actually complete the task using just your task analysis. So for example, if I wanted to see if this task analysis included all of the component parts of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I would give this task analysis to somebody and say, okay, make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich using only what these steps tell you to do. And what this will help you do is identify if you're actually missing any portion of it. So for example, if I forgot to say to scoop out the jelly, and it just went straight from spread peanut butter and then spread jelly, you know, sometimes you miss those steps. So it's important to have somebody else go ahead and take a look at your task analysis and make sure that it includes all of those steps. Here's an example of using some visual prompts to support the visual task analysis. So instead of just telling a child, you know, this is the final, what it looks like to hold your golf club, we're going to show them the steps that are involved in getting from point A to point B. So this is really helpful in showing a student all the different levels of the task analysis. The next evidence-based strategy that we're going to talk about are antecedent-based interventions. Antecedent-based interventions are those that make positive behavior more likely and challenging behavior less likely. And so these are things that we put in place in an educational environment or in the home or in the community so that we can support positive behavior. And there's a number of ways that we can do this. One way that we could do this is by modifying educational activities or materials or the schedule. So for example, if we know that a student is really interested in SpongeBob, they really like that character, we might be able to include that interest in a math activity. So having a child do a math activity using SpongeBob characters, so that it incorporates the student's interest in with the educational activity. Another really important aspect is incorporating student choice. This is a really wonderful way to give students some control over their educational setting and educational experiences. You might be able to provide large choices. For example, if you have the ability to say, you know, do you want to do math first or do you want to do reading first? That might be a really great choice. You might look at smaller choices. Would you rather use this pencil or this pencil when you're completing your math worksheets? Or would you like to sit on this side or would you like to sit on this side? And sometimes providing those choices can really help a student participate really successfully in some of those educational settings. We also want to make sure that we're preparing students ahead of time for upcoming activities. So letting them know we're going to talk a little bit about schedules and other ways to support transitions, but letting students know what's coming next. So giving them warning, saying 1 more minute, and then it's going to be time to go to the next activity. One thing we also want to be very conscious of is varying the format and the level of difficulty of instruction. So we don't want students to become overly frustrated. We want to make sure that we're presenting a balanced level of difficult tasks to easier tasks. So if we're presenting lots of new math examples, we want to intersperse math that they have mastered so that we're not just working on very, very difficult tasks, or we're rotating from activities of sitting at a table to getting up and moving around, and making sure that our daily schedule is balanced, as well as our educational materials as we're going through the lessons. We also want to make sure that we're enriching the environment and providing extra visual cues, that we're providing access to sensory stimulation within the environment, and that we're modifying prompting and reinforcement schedules and delivery. So we're making sure that there are lots of different choices of reinforcers. And thinking back towards giving students choices, students should really have choices about what they want to earn. And that's not just at the beginning of the week. That should be at the beginning of every session. It could be, in the middle of a session if you find that a student isn't really interested in what it was that they had chosen initially, giving a choice of what would you like to earn during this activity? What are we earning for our next activity? So incorporating those choices, not just in the beginning of an activity, but maybe throughout the activity as well. Another really good way that we can modify the environment is through differentiating instruction. As most of us know, students with ASD have diverse learning styles. They often have splinter skills, so areas of strength and areas of weakness, and they're not necessarily an even profile in terms of their educational profile. So it's really important for us to understand what those areas of need and what those areas of strength are so that we can program appropriately. There's lots of different ways to differentiate instruction. One way that we can do this is by grouping students according to ability. So having a group of students that are working on very similar goals in small group instruction, so that the teacher is providing instruction that is very similar and they're using materials that are very similar for a small group of students. And then when the next group comes, they're using different materials because the needs of that group are different than the first group. So that's a way to differentiate instruction during small group. But differentiating instruction doesn't just have to happen in small group instruction. We can differentiate instruction during large group instruction as well. And one way that we could do this is making sure that the materials and access to responding is available for all types of learners in a large group instruction. So for example, if we were doing a morning meeting, we might have students who are responding verbally to greetings and participating verbally. We also might have students who are using pictures in a picture book, or using signs, or using some form of technology to greet. And so making sure that all of those materials are available so that all of the students in the group have a chance to participate is really, really important. One of the next strategies is schedules. So schedules are a set of pictures or words or that cue an individual to engage in a sequence of activities. So these can be pictures from BoardMaker, which is a software system. It could be pictures that you just take with your phone and download and print. Schedules can be used in classrooms and other environments to promote independent functioning. And schedules can vary widely in terms of what we're talking about using the schedules for. So we can start with schedules that are used to sequence very, very concrete activities. So for example, in an activity schedule, we might have a student who is scheduling their leisure skills. So first they're going to complete a puzzle, then they're going to complete some lacing cards, then they're going to do a coloring sheet, and then they're going to get to watch TV for a little bit. All the way up to really advanced schedules. Most of us use daily and weekly planners. So as students' needs change, we can change the style of the schedule, and they could be really helpful. Students with ASD sometimes have difficulty with transitions or when things are not exactly as they usually are. And one way to support these transitions is through the use of schedules. Okay, the next strategy that we're going to talk about is modeling. So the goal of modeling is to correctly demonstrate a behavior so that another person can imitate the model. So when we're thinking about modeling, there are actually two different types of modeling that we're talking about. The first is live modeling. And live modeling is when a person demonstrates the behavior in the presence of the student. So if I show you what to do, I say do this, and then the child imitates that. If I'm showing a child how I play with a toy, and then the child is playing with the toy, but I'm doing that actually with the child. So that's a live model. And one of the things that's really important with live modeling is that you clearly define the target behavior. So what am I trying to teach with modeling? And it's important to make sure that all of the people in the child's life who are going to use modeling as an educational tool are modeling the same behavior. It's really important too that when we're presenting modeling in an instructional setting, that we get the student's attention first, so that we're making sure that the child is attending to us and watching the thing that we're modeling in order to be able to imitate that action. And one of the key components in all of these strategies is independence. We're using these strategies in order to support the child in learning skills that hopefully will be independent very quickly. So when we're using these strategies, we always want to be aware that we need to have a plan to fade out our strategy so that the student is responding independently. So when we're thinking about, teaching a skill through modeling, we want to also have in place and in our minds how we're going to fade out that model so the student can become more and more independent. The second type of modeling is video modeling. And so video modeling is a procedure where the student imitates video actions or sequences from a model. So video modeling has been used very successfully to teach a number of different behaviors. It's been used to teach play skills, ranging from very simple play skills like putting together a Mr. Potato Head, all the way to more advanced, cooperative play skills with two children together or children in a classroom, social skills, communication skills, adaptive skills, for example, crossing the street, making a snack, academic skills. So there's lots of different ways that video modeling can be used to support the acquisition of a lot of different types of skills. There are several different types of video modeling and how you present the video and how you create the video. So the first one that we'll talk about is called basic video modeling. And in basic video modeling, we're going to record somebody other than the learner. We're going to record somebody completing the skill. So for example, if we're thinking about toothbrushing, we'll take somebody, it could be a parent, it could be a peer or sibling or another teacher, and that person is going to brush their teeth while we record that person brushing their teeth. So it's somebody other than the learner who's demonstrating the behavior, and we're going to record it and show that video to the learner at a later time. The second type of video modeling is video self-modeling, and that's pretty much what the title describes, that we're going to use the learner to display the target behavior. And so we're going to film the learner participating in the behavior and then show that video to the learner at a different time. The third is point of view video modeling. And that's when the target behavior or skill is recorded from the perspective of the learner. So the video shows what the learner would be seeing as they completed the task. So for example, if we were going to take a video of completing a vocational task like sorting and rolling silverware, you might just see the hands from the perspective of the person looking down and getting the silverware and rolling and sorting it. Finally, video prompting can be used, and video prompting involves breaking the behavior or skill into steps and recording each step with incorporated pauses during which the learner may attempt the step before viewing subsequent steps. So for video modeling, some of the procedures for implementation, the teacher needs to identify the skill to be targeted and clearly define the target behavior. So we need to know exactly what the behavior is going to look like on that video so that we know exactly what we're targeting. The teacher then needs to write down all of the steps, like in a task analysis, as well as the script. So if we're going to be using words as part of the video, as part of the skill that we're going to be videotaping, then that script needs to be written out as well. The teacher is going to record the target behavior and then present the video to the student. And the way that the video can be presented in today's day and age of technology, we have access to so many different ways to present information to students. One way could be through a laptop computer or a desktop desktop computer, but we can also present information on an iPad or an iPhone, and have that be the medium by which students are watching those videos. The expectation is that we're going to show the video to the student, and then the student is going to imitate the actions without prompting. And as with all of the skills that we're going to be looking at, we want to make sure that we're taking data so that we know that the student is actually making progress on the skills that we're targeting. This is a little video on video modeling, and I'm not going to show you the video just in the interest of time, but I'm just going to show you that this is a basic video modeling, so you can see the person's hands. You'll be able to see that the person is engaging with the toy. And what we would do is take this video and then record it with the teacher or the other parent or peer performing the actions, and then we'd let the student watch the video. We'd then remove the video and present these same exact materials to the learner and take data on how many steps the learner is completing independently from the video. The next strategy we're going to talk about is prompting. A prompt is an additional cue or extra help from the teacher to aid the student in engaging in the correct response. So it's just some help that we're going to provide to the student so that they're able to complete the task independently. The purpose of prompting is to give the learner more opportunities to respond correctly. So we want the student to experience success. We want them to be able to complete the task that we're asking them to do. But it's very, very important that we're fading these prompts because we want to make sure that the learner is becoming more and more independent, and that's a key component of the prompting effectively. Some key characteristics of prompting is that they should be effective. That is, prompts should ensure that the learner will perform the behavior. So we want to make sure that we're prompting before the student responds and not as a correction, so that we're helping the student to become successful and experience what the correct answer is. And it should be easy to fade. Like I said, the goal of prompting is to teach independent responding. So we want students to be independent in responding to the learning task. So it's really important that we have a procedure to fade those prompts. So here's a diagram of the prompting hierarchy. So as you can see in the top, there's independence. And so as we go from the top of the pyramid to the bottom of the pyramid, we're using more and more intrusive prompts. So we're providing more and more help as we go from the top of the pyramid to the bottom. So as you can see, there's independence at the top and full physical prompts at the bottom. When we're teaching a new skill, we really want to be using a most to least prompting procedure. And what I mean by most to least prompting procedure is that we're going to be initially prompting the student to engage in the response completely. So we're not expecting any level of independence initially. So we're going to completely physically help the child to perform the task. So for example, going back to my discrete trial example of teaching colors, if we say touch red, a full physical prompt would be actually taking the learner's hand and helping them touch the red card. And as we fade those prompts out, as we go from full physical, we'd move to a lighter physical response. So we'd fade and maybe just hold the learner by his elbow in order to touch the correct card. When we're teaching a skill that maybe is inconsistently performed by the learner, something that they've learned in the past but they don't always respond correctly, then we might want to use least to most prompting. So that would be where we were moving from, we would give the opportunity for the child to respond independently, and then when the child did not respond independently or was going to make an error, we would provide a more intrusive prompt. So here are some pictures that show exactly what I'm talking about in terms of full physical, partial physical, and gestural prompts. So on the top, you see full physical prompts. This parent's hand is on the child's hand, helping them tie their shoelaces. On the bottom picture, the partial physical prompt, you can see that the parent or teacher is still helping the child engage in the behavior, but much less so than in the full physical prompt. So they're holding kind of at the child's elbow and helping them to complete the steps, but not completely helping. And that's one way of fading out our prompts, is to provide a lot of help, and then we provide less and less help as the student becomes more and more successful and independent. In the example of the gestural prompt, the teacher is pointing to the dog, and that's that gesture of pointing to the dog as the prompt. So some prompting guidelines to consider. We want to use nonverbal prompts when possible. A verbal prompt is very difficult to fade. whereas we can fade our verbal prompt. So one way to do that is if we gave a prompt of, we showed a child, going back to the colors, if we showed the child red and said, what color is this? Red. A full verbal prompt would be, we would say red. We can fade out that verbal prompt by providing less and less of an example. So instead of saying it's red, we would say re or and that would be providing less and less of a verbal prompt. So that would be one way to fade out our verbal prompts for a skill. And we want to make sure that we're fading as soon as possible. So we really want to be monitoring our data and making sure that students are responding more and more independently. So a question being, how would you handle prompt dependence? And that's a really great question because that's something that we face a lot when we're teaching new skills, is a child becoming very dependent on our prompt. And one way that we can address prompt dependency initially is to make sure that we're fading very quickly. Another way is to provide reinforcement for independent responses. So differentiating the level of reinforcement that we're providing. So for example, if we're teaching a skill of, I want to use a different example other than touch red. If we're teaching a sorting task, and we started with full physical prompting and the child was receiving reinforcement for that full physical prompt and participating in that activity, and we moved to a light physical prompt, we would provide more reinforcement for completing the task using less prompting, versus if the child needed more prompting, we provide less reinforcement or no reinforcement. So that's one way to help a student understand, when I do it by myself, it's a lot better. I get a lot more reinforcement for completing it by myself, versus when I complete it when somebody helps me, I get less reinforcement. So hope that answers your question. Okay, great. And then you also want to consider whether or not you're going to be using least to most or most to least prompting. So as I talked about in the last slide, if you're teaching a brand new skill, it's important to make sure that the student knows the expectations and can respond correctly. And so we probably want to use a most to least teaching procedure. But in thinking about prompt dependency, if it's a skill that's consistently performed, we still want to give students an opportunity to respond independently. So we might want to use a least to most prompting procedure and reinforce independence more heavily than prompted responses. The next strategy that we're going to talk about is incidental and naturalistic teaching. This is teaching that, based on its name, it's teaching that occurs in the natural environment. We're going to capitalize on teachable moments. So these are things that happen automatically throughout the course of the day. One of the benefits to this is that we don't need additional material, that we're capitalizing on periods of high motivation. So for example, there's a ball that's out of reach that's on a shelf, and the child really loves playing with the ball, or the remote for the TV is out of reach. The student is very motivated to do something to get access to the ball or to get access to the remote. So that gives us an opportunity to provide a teaching moment, whether that is prompting the child to verbally ask for the ball or sign the ball. It gives us an opportunity to do that, and then to provide a naturalistic consequence to that behavior. And what I mean by naturalistic consequence is a natural reinforcer. So a natural reinforcer for asking for the ball would be getting the ball, would be getting to play with the ball. One of the benefits of incidental teaching is that it facilitates generalization, and we're going to talk a lot about generalization in just a little bit, but essentially it gives you an opportunity to practice the skills in the environment in which those skills are going to need to be used. So when you see a ball and you want to ask for a ball, that's when you need to know how to ask for a ball. And so it's more naturalistic than asking for a ball just to ask during a more contrived situation. These techniques can be applied within a broad range of activities and settings. So we can capitalize on natural teaching opportunities in the community, at home, at school, anywhere that we are. And that, like I said, we use natural reinforcers in this procedure. If a student is thirsty and they ask for water, then we're going to give them water. And getting that water is a natural reinforcer for asking for water. The next strategy that we're going to talk about are story-based interventions. The most well-known are social stories. I'm sure many of you are familiar with social stories, but they're not the only way that literature and words can be used to support learning and in an educational setting. There are many other narratives. We can use comic strips. We can use just words in a PowerPoint and some pictures. And social narratives can be used to support schedule changes, to promote independence of daily living. So, for example, we conducted a study where we used literacy-based intervention to teach students to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, to clarify expectations, promote positive behavior, and support social interactions. So, for example, a social story to say what's going to happen at a birthday party, and what are some ways that you can interact at a birthday party or in a specific situation, or going to the doctor is a great example, to give children, adults, some expectations of what's going to happen when they go to the doctor's office, and what can they expect and what is going to be expected of them. So here's an example of a story that we use in the Els Guimond autism clinics. And this is a social story designed to support participation in a golf activity. So as you can see, there's words to describe what's happening. So if a student is not a reader, that's okay. We can read the words to them. But then there's also pictures to support that understanding. So we use both of those to sort of reach a number of learners and make sure that we're supporting comprehension and making sure that it's applicable to all the different learners. So this is an example of a way that we would talk about what the student can expect, as well as what the behavioral expectations of that student are. The next strategy we'll talk about is the picture exchange communication system. Yes, a question regarding whether social stories are effective with kids that can't read. They can be, where the pictures help to support the understanding of what the words are. And so that's one way to sort of support the understanding of the social story. So including those pictures. We can also, this is a lot of words in this particular social story, but you can make it very simple and just have 1 or 2 words, or make the words very basic depending on the reading level of the students that you're working with. So for example, if you have students that are reading, including some of those basic sight words, or words that we know that they understand, you can include some of those words instead of having a much longer narrative. Hope that answers your question. So the picture exchange communication system, I'm not going to talk about it too much. This is something that was addressed in the communication module, but I am going to talk a little bit about it. The picture exchange communication system is a communication system, obviously, that was developed by Andrew Bondi and Lori Frost. It is not just the use of pictures, and I think that's a common misconception with PECS, is that it's just the use of pictures, and it's a much more involved curriculum and training process than that. In PECS, the learner is taught to give a picture of a desired item to a communicative partner. There are 6 phases of PECS instruction, with multiple steps, and each builds on the next level, or on the last level. So the first stage of PECS is teaching the physical exchange. So just having a child hand over the card to a communicative partner. So that's the first stage of PECS. We move through these levels and gradually increase the expectations and the complexity of the communication. So we end with being able to comment in response to questions. So textbooks can be used not just to request, but also to comment on things. I hear something, or I feel something. So it's not just a request system. So here's some examples of, you see a PECS book on the top. Sometimes they're divided into sections depending on the amount of pictures that a child is able to successfully scan through and select amongst. In the first example, there's dividers for food or toys, pictures that are available at school. Maybe there are some activities that are only available at school versus some activities that parents have access to at home, and vice versa. So that might be helpful for a student to have that organized. In the bottom, you can see the sentence strip, I want more, and then there are some choices of edible items. So the student's able to make a complete sentence and then turn over that sentence strip in order to request. So in addition to identifying and utilizing evidence-based strategies, teachers must establish efficient and effective learning environments. So they have to be able to implement these strategies that are going to support learning and support a positive classroom environment, because we can have really wonderful strategies, but if we don't have a classroom that supports the learning of the students in there, then we're not going to be able to implement those strategies effectively. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is generalization. And what generalization means is that a learner can perform a skill under conditions that are different from those conditions that were in place when the behavior was first learned. So for example, if a student is able to do something across different settings, so not just at school, but they're able to complete the same behavior at home, they're able to complete the same behavior out in the community or at a friend's house across different people. So it's not just with this one teacher that they're able to complete the task, but with another teacher, with a parent, with a different therapist, and with different stimuli. So they're able to respond appropriately, not just when we're given, I gave the example of a vocational task of rolling silverware, but with a variety of different silverware in a variety of different settings with a variety of different people. And we really need to make sure that we don't consider a skill mastered until it can be displayed across all of these things. And so that's something that we see sometimes, is that in a classroom setting, a student masters a skill and then it's sort of moved to a maintenance folder, when in reality, we need to really focus on the generalization of that skill. If the student can perform a skill in one environment, but can't perform it in other environments, then it's not going to be a really helpful skill for that student. So for example, if we teach a child to tie their shoes, and they can do that at school, but they can't tie their shoes at home or when they're on the playground, then it's not a really helpful skill for that student. And we wouldn't say that the student knows how to tie their shoes, because they haven't been able to generalize that skill across whether it's different shoes, different places, or when different people say, okay, it's time to tie your shoes. So there are some ways that we can make sure that we're programming for generalization and making sure that students are able to generalize those skills across these different components. One way that we could do that is by practicing mastered skills in different settings. So we want to make sure that we're teaching the student to tie their shoes with these shoes. We're making sure at school we're doing it at the park when the child's shoelace gets untied, and we're doing it at home before they leave to go for school. Have students work on skills with different teachers. So if we're working on a sorting task or identifying animals, that it's not just one teacher that's working with that child, that the child is able to work with different teachers, that parents are able to do it, therapists are able to present the same instruction, and the student is able to respond in the same way. And use incidental teaching strategies. We talked a little bit about maximizing the natural opportunities that occur within the child's day, within the student's day. And we want to make sure that we do that so that we can promote generalization. So if we're teaching a student to request in the classroom, when natural opportunities arise in which we can practice requesting, we want to make sure that we're doing that. And we also want to make the training setting as close to the target setting as possible. So for example, I'll use another vocational example. If we're teaching a vocational skill of stacking a shelf, one way that we can support generalization is to have actual groceries available and have the shelves set up to look like an actual grocery store, so that when the student goes from the training environment into the actual vocational environment, that transition is much more fluid, and they are able to generalize the skill that they learned in the classroom environment into the natural environment much more easily. The next strategy, the next topic we're going to talk about is maintenance. And generalization and maintenance are two components that need to be explicitly taught. So these are things that may not naturally occur for students with ASD. Students with ASD may not generalize skills without us actually programming for generalization, as well as maintenance. And what maintenance means is that the student is able to continue to use a skill after the teaching of that skill has been discontinued. So we really want to make sure that students are having an opportunity to practice mastered skills across time. So after we teach a skill, we want to make sure that we don't just put that skill away and not address it again, that we're consistently reviewing it so that the student is able to maintain the skill that they've learned. A great example of this is when students take foreign languages. I know I took a foreign language in high school. I took many years of French, but I didn't maintain any of those skills because I didn't have a communicative partner that spoke French. And so I didn't use it. And when you don't use it, you lose it. And so it's really important to make sure that when we teach a skill, that we're giving students lots of opportunities to practice that skill and keep it fresh in their repertoire. So what are some ways to address maintenance? So the first way that we could do that is to fade and thin the schedule of reinforcement. So for example, if we're teaching a child to raise their hand during class, initially when we're teaching that skill, we might want to call on that student every time they raise their hand. So they raise their hand and we're saying, yes, Chrissy, what's the answer, and allowing them to respond. However, when that child transitions into a classroom, they're probably not going to get called on every time. So we need to make sure that we're thinning the schedule of reinforcement so that it more closely matches what the student is going to encounter in the natural environment. So if we didn't thin that schedule of reinforcement and every time the child raised their hand, they were getting called on, and then they go into another setting, into a kindergarten classroom where that's just not possible, they might stop raising their hand completely. So we want to make sure that we're programming for that so that the students' skills are strengthened and they're able to use it across environments. We also want to introduce naturally occurring reinforcers. So we talked a little bit about what are naturally occurring reinforcers, but let's think about tying shoes. Initially, if we're teaching the skill of tying shoes, we might need to add a reinforcer that might be artificial, for example, an edible. So we're teaching the skill and the student is earning access to edible reinforcement following completion of tying their shoes. And one thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is introducing the naturally occurring reinforcers. And one of the naturally occurring reinforcers for tying your shoes might be to get to go outside and play on the playground. And so we're fading out our reinforcement using our edibles and trying to make the natural occurring reinforcement of you tie your shoes, then you get to go play on the playground, what actually is maintaining the behavior. And like I said before, we want to make sure that we're practicing or probing the skill regularly. So after we teach a skill, we want to make sure that we're reintroducing it. And this is something that we talked about in the antecedent-based interventions. We don't want to just introduce difficult, brand new tasks. We want to intersperse maintenance tasks and making sure that students are working on acquisition and more difficult things, but that we're also reminding them of all the other skills that they've already mastered and easier tasks because they've already learned them. There are several key aspects in supporting learning within the classroom, and one thing that we always need to be aware of and striving towards is creating positive relationships in positive classroom environments. One way to do that is through pairing and making sure that we establish ourselves as sources of reinforcement. And that is something when we see a student, the student should be running towards us, not away from us. And if they are running away from us, then we need to revisit this aspect of pairing and making sure that when a student sees us, that they are associating us with access to really good things. And the same with the classroom. The classroom should be Disney World. It should house wonderful opportunities for fun things for the student. And in order to make sure that we're doing this, we really need to find out what motivates our students. And we need to do this by asking parents and caregivers, siblings, finding out what those potential reinforcers are, and then pairing ourselves with them and pairing the classroom with those potential reinforcers. We want to make school meaningful, and we also want to make school fun. We want to make sure that we're maintaining professional teacher-student relationships and creating trusting relationships and good rapport between parents and professionals and students. Teachers should always be treating students with dignity and kindness and respect and compassion, and being aware of all of those factors that can contribute to a bad day in the classroom, or communicating with families and making sure that we're describing the day and sharing information in a very kind and compassionate way. One way to maintain positive student-teacher relationships is looking at things that we should always really refrain from. Obviously, from rough physical redirection. Instead of physically redirecting a student in obviously a rough way, we'd rather use verbal or gestural redirection, telling a student to get down, using a gesture instead of grabbing them off of a stool and plopping them on the ground. Making sure that we don't use physical intervention with a student that's not in a crisis. that we're using verbal or gestural prompting strategies, but that we're also using reinforcement strategies, that we've had those developed and we're always ready to sort of rely on those reinforcement strategies. That we're not reacting to challenging behavior, that we're really being proactive and looking at some of those antecedent-based interventions. And we're going to talk a little bit about motivating students and reinforcement strategies. We want to make sure that we're being proactive and setting the student up for success as opposed to reacting to challenging behavior after the fact. We don't want to use loud or assertive directions or sarcastic or coercive comments. We want to use clear and direct verbal prompts. We want to make sure that we're at a student's level and providing very clear, simple directions. And then we're providing positive behavior-specific praise. I love the way you used your words. You did such a nice job raising your hand, those kind of things. And now we're going to talk about motivating students to learn. This is, again, a topic that was covered in the Behavior Basics module, but we're going to talk a little bit about it here because it is such an important piece of the educational environment. Students with ASD might not have the same motivations as a typically developing student. Common intrinsic motivation for typically developing students might be to please an adult, or social praise might be a really powerful motivator for some students. They enjoy the tasks at hand. And that might not be the case for our students with ASD. They might require a little bit more reinforcement in order to learn some of these skills. So we can do this in a number of ways. One really wonderful way is to develop a conditioned reinforcement system. This could be tokens or dollars, and we pair these with really positive reinforcers. So tokens, you get so many tokens, and then you get access to a really powerful reinforcer like the computer or a snack item. Checklists and behavior contracts, setting up ahead of time what the expectations are for the student. And once the student meets those expectations, then they get access to reinforcement. First then boards can be a wonderful tool. They're sometimes misused. One way that they're misused is when the first and the then are both non-preferred activities. So they're used more as just letting students know what's happening as opposed to thinking about those antecedent-based interventions and thinking about reinforcement. The way that we should be setting it up is that the first is a preferred activity, or the first is a less preferred activity, and the then is a much more preferred activity. For example, first put on your shoes, then you can watch TV. Or first we're going to do our math worksheet, and then we're going to go out on the playground. Differential reinforcement procedures are procedures where we are reinforcing positive behaviors or other behaviors and putting other inappropriate behaviors on extinction and not attending to them. And point or level systems. This is, for example, if a student is on a level 3, they might be able to earn reinforcers that are much more powerful, like trips out into the community, whereas a level 1 might mean you're able to earn breaks in the classroom. So as students earn more points and move up levels, they're able to earn greater and greater reinforcers. So now that we know a lot of strategies and we know good classroom techniques, how do we know what to teach and what strategies to use? We need to do assessments, and we need to understand where a student's abilities lie and where their needs are. And then we need to know how well are our students responding. And I alluded to it before, that we need to make sure that we're taking data on all of the skills that we're teaching. So we need to constantly be aware, how is the student doing on this particular task? Are they learning the task? Are they needing additional help? Are they needing more prompting? Have we hit a plateau and we need to change the procedure? All of this stuff comes from collecting data. And all of this information is going to be targeted in another learning module where we're going to talk more explicitly on assessment and data collection procedures. Now, this is the end of our teaching strategies presentation, our teaching strategies module. This resource page will provide you with different links. As I mentioned earlier, the National Standards Project and the National Professional Development Center. The National Professional Development Center, in addition to coming up with these 27 different evidence-based strategies, they also created modules and free online modules. So if you click on that link, it'll take you to those 27 different interventions and the modules that are associated with them, as well as the bottom, the Autism Internet modules. Those are going to give you how to implement the strategies, some commonly asked questions, a pre and a post test so that it really assesses your knowledge on all of the different evidence-based strategies. But those are all really great resources to sort of help guide your selection of evidence-based practices for students with ASD. Does anybody have any questions? Well, good. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have, and I thank you for joining me today. Thank you. I appreciate you coming or signing on.